Imagine I told you that a family has two children, and at least one of them is a boy. What's the probability that the other child is also a boy? Your brain probably jumped to 50-50, right? After all, the second child is either a boy or a girl, so it should be a coin flip. But here's the thing that's going to absolutely blow your mind. You're wrong. Dead wrong. And so is almost everyone else when they first encountered this problem. Welcome back to the channel, where we dive deep into the mysteries that make our brains hurt in the best possible way. Today, we're exploring one of the most famous paradoxes in probability theory, the boy or girl paradox. It's deceptively simple, infuriatingly counterintuitive, and has been breaking brains for decades. By the end of this video, you'll understand why our intuition fails us so spectacularly, and you'll never look at probability the same way again. But first, hit that subscribe button and ring the notification bell, because we're about to embark on a journey that will challenge everything you think you know about chance and probability. Let's start with the classic formulation of this paradox. It seems so straightforward that you might wonder why it's even worth discussing. But trust me, we're about to dive into mathematical quicksand. Here's the setup. Mr. Smith has two children. You learn that at least one of his children is a boy. What's the probability that both children are boys? Take a moment to think about this. I know what you're thinking, because it's what everyone thinks initially. You're probably reasoning like this. Well, I know one child is a boy. The other child is either a boy or a girl. Since boys and girls are equally likely, the probability must be 1/2. This reasoning seems so logical, so obvious, that it's hard to imagine it could be wrong. But it is wrong. The correct answer is 1/3, not 50%. 1/3. And if that doesn't make your brain feel like it's been turned inside out, you're either a mathematical genius or you haven't fully grasped what I just said. Let me repeat this because it's crucial. If you know that a two-child family has at least one boy, the probability that both children are boys is 1/3, not 1/2. This isn't a trick question, and it's not wordplay. It's pure mathematics, and it reveals something profound about how probability actually works versus how we think it works. The reason this paradox is so powerful is that it exposes a fundamental flaw in human reasoning about probability. We have intuitive ways of thinking about chance that work well in everyday life, but completely break down in certain mathematical contexts. This paradox is like a stress test for our probabilistic intuition, and most of us fail that test spectacularly. Before we dive into why the answer is 1/3, let's establish some ground rules and build our mathematical foundation. We need to be crystal clear about our assumptions, because small changes in how we interpret the problem can lead to dramatically different answers. First, let's assume that boys and girls are equally likely. In reality, the ratio isn't exactly 50-50, but it's close enough for our purposes. We're also assuming that the gender of one child doesn't influence the gender of the other child, which is true in reality. Now, let's think about all the possible outcomes for a two-child family. There are exactly 4 equally likely possibilities, and this is where things get interesting. The first child can be either a boy or a girl, and the second child can be either a boy or a girl. So our complete set of possibilities is first child boy, second child boy. Let's call this boy boy, or BB for short. First child boy, second child girl. That's boy girl, or BG. First child girl, second child boy. That's girl boy, or GB. First child girl, second child girl. That's girl girl, or GG. Each of these 4 outcomes is equally likely, with a probability of 1/4 or 25%. This is fundamental to understanding why our intuition goes wrong. Here's the key insight. When we're told that at least one child is a boy, we're not randomly selecting one child and learning its gender. Instead, we're learning something about the family composition that eliminates certain possibilities from our list. If at least one child is a boy, then the girl-girl outcome is impossible. We can cross GG off our list. That leaves us with 3 equally likely possibilities: BB, BG, and GB. And here's the crucial point. Only one of these three remaining possibilities. BB represents a case where both children are boys. Let's work through this calculation step by step, because the mathematics here is both beautiful and revealing. We start with our four equally likely outcomes. BB, BG, GB, and GG. Each has a probability of 1/4. When we learn that at least one child is a boy, we're applying what mathematicians call a conditional probability. We're asking, given that at least one child is a boy, what's the probability that both are boys? The condition "at least one child is a boy" eliminates the GG outcome. In probability theory, when we apply a condition that eliminates some outcomes, we need to renormalize the remaining probabilities so they still add up to 1. Originally, BB, BG, and GB each had probability 1/4. But now we know that one of these three outcomes must be true. So we need to rescale these probabilities. Since we had three outcomes each with probability 1/4, and 1/4 plus 1/4 plus 1/4 equals 3/4, we divide each probability by 3/4 to renormalize. 1/4 divided by 3/4 equals 1/3. So each of our three remaining outcomes, BB, BG, and GB, now has probability 1/3. Since only BB represents the case where both children are boys, the probability that both children are boys, given that at least one is a boy, is 1/3. This mathematical process is called applying Bayes' theorem. It's named after the 18th century mathematician Thomas Bayes. It's a fundamental principle in probability theory that describes how to update probabilities when we receive new information. Now let's dig into why this result feels so wrong to our intuitive understanding of probability. There are several psychological and cognitive factors at play here, and understanding them helps us appreciate both the power and the limitations of human reasoning. The first issue is what psychologists call the representativeness heuristic. When we think about the other child, we naturally imagine a specific child, and we ask ourselves whether that child is a boy or a girl. Since boys and girls are equally likely, we conclude the probability is 50-50. But here's the problem. There is no other child in any meaningful sense. We haven't randomly selected one child and asked about the other. Instead, we've learned something about the family composition that constrains the possible outcomes. Think about it this way. If I told you that a family has two children and exactly one of them is a boy, then yes, the probability that the boy sibling is also a boy would be 50%. But that's not what we're told. We're told that at least one is a boy, which is a weaker condition that applies to more families. Another way our intuition fails is through what we might call the sample space confusion. We naturally think of the sample space as having two outcomes. The other child is a boy or the other child is a girl. But the correct sample space has three outcomes. The family composition is BBBG or GB. This confusion arises because we're thinking about the problem from the perspective of a randomly chosen child within the family, rather than from the perspective of randomly chosen families that meet our condition. It's a subtle but crucial difference. There's also an element of what cognitive scientists call the conjunction fallacy at play. We're better at reasoning about simple, direct probabilities than about conditional probabilities that depend on multiple constraints. To help make this more intuitive, let's explore some real-world analogies that capture the same mathematical structure. Imagine you're at a school where every family has exactly two children. You're looking for families where at least one child is in the advanced mathematics program. Let's say that exactly half of all children are in this program. And whether one child is in the program doesn't affect whether their sibling is. Now, you randomly select a family that meets your criterion. At least one child is in the advanced math program. What's the probability that both children in this family are in the program? Using the same logic as our boy-girl problem, there are three types of families that meet your criterion. Families where the first child is in the program, but the second isn't. Families where the second child is in the program, but the first isn't. and families where both children are in the program. These three types are equally likely among families that meet your criterion. So the probability that both children are in the program is 1/3, not 1/2. Here's another analogy. Imagine you have a bag containing 4 equally weighted balls. 2 are red, 1 is blue, and 1 is green. You randomly draw 2 balls without replacement. Someone tells you that at least one of your balls is red. What's the probability that both balls are red? There are 6 possible pairs of balls you could draw: red-red, red-blue, red-green, blue-red, green-red, and blue-green. When you learn that at least one ball is red, you eliminate the blue-green possibility. That leaves 5 possibilities, and only one of them, red-red, satisfies the condition that both balls are red. Wait, that's not quite right. Let me recalculate this. Actually, if we have 2 red balls, 1 blue and 1 green, the possible pairs are red 1, red 2, red 1, blue, red 1, green, red 2, blue red, 2 green, and blue green and blue green. The condition at least one red eliminates only blue green, leaving 5 possibilities. Only red red has both balls red, so the probability is 1/5. This analogy isn't quite capturing the same structure. Let me try a different approach. Here's a better analogy. Imagine a dating app where you're looking at profiles of couples. Each person in each couple independently has a 50% chance of liking hiking. You filter for couples where at least one person likes hiking. Among these filtered couples, what fraction will have both people liking hiking? This perfectly mirrors our boy-girl problem. There are 4 types of couples. Both like hiking. First likes hiking, but second doesn't. Second likes hiking, but first doesn't. And neither likes hiking. The last type gets filtered out. Among the remaining 3 types, only one has both people liking hiking. So the answer is 1/3. One of the fascinating aspects of the boy or girl paradox is how sensitive it is to the exact wording of the problem. Small changes in how the question is phrased can lead to dramatically different answers. And this sensitivity reveals deep truths about probability and information. Let's explore some variations and see how they change the answer. Variation 1. A family has 2 children. You meet one of the children, and he's a boy. What's the probability that the other child is also a boy? In this case, the answer is 50%, not 1/3. Why? Because you've randomly sampled one specific child and learned his gender. This is different from learning that the family composition includes at least one boy. Variation 2. A family has 2 children. The father says, "At least one of my children is a boy." What's the probability that both children are boys? This might seem identical to our original problem, but some argue it's different because of selection bias. If fathers are more likely to mention boys than girls, then this statement provides different information than a random sampling would. Variation 3. A family has 2 children. At least one is a boy born on Tuesday. What's the probability that both children are boys? Surprisingly, adding the seemingly irrelevant information about Tuesday changes the answer. It becomes 13/27, not 1/3. This happens because the additional constraint makes the different family compositions no longer equally likely after conditioning. These variations highlight a crucial point. In probability problems, every detail matters. The way information is obtained, the way the question is asked. And even seemingly irrelevant details can change the mathematical structure of the problem. This sensitivity isn't a bug in probability theory, it's a feature. Probability is fundamentally about information, and different ways of obtaining information provide different constraints on the possible outcomes. Our brains often gloss over these subtle differences, treating different scenarios as equivalent when they're mathematically distinct. The boy or girl paradox has a rich history that spans several decades and involves some of the most prominent figures in probability theory and recreational mathematics. The earliest version of this paradox appeared in the 1950s, but it gained widespread attention through the work of Martin Gardner. the legendary recreational mathematics columnist for Scientific American. Gardner presented various forms of the paradox in his columns throughout the 1960s and 70s, and each time he received hundreds of letters from readers insisting he was wrong. This reaction is itself fascinating. The paradox doesn't just challenge our mathematical intuition, it challenges it so strongly that people become emotionally invested in proving it wrong. There's something about the one-third answer that feels not just incorrect, but almost insulting to our intelligence. In the 1970s and 80s, the paradox was further developed and analyzed by probability theorists and philosophers. They explored its connections to other famous problems in probability, like the Monty Hall problem, which we'll discuss shortly. The paradox also played a significant role in debates about how to interpret probability itself. Different schools of thought in probability theory, such as frequentist and Bayesian approaches, sometimes gave different analyses of the same problem, leading to heated academic debates. One of the most famous instances occurred in the 1990s when Marilyn Vos Savant, holder of the Guinness World Record for highest IQ, presented a related problem in her Parade magazine column. She received over 10,000 letters, many from PhD mathematicians, insisting she was wrong. Of course, she was right, but the intensity of the reaction showed how deeply these paradoxes challenge our thinking. The boy or girl paradox belongs to a family of counterintuitive problems in probability theory. Understanding its connections to other famous paradoxes helps us see the broader patterns in how our probabilistic reasoning goes astray. The most famous relative is probably the Monty Hall problem. In that puzzle, you choose one of three doors, one of which hides a prize. The host, who knows where the prize is, opens one of the other doors to reveal no prize, then offers you the chance to switch. Most people think switching doesn't matter, but actually, switching doubles your chances of winning. Both problems share a crucial feature. They involve conditional probability where our intuition fails, because we don't properly account for how information eliminates possibilities from our sample space. Another related paradox is the two-envelope problem. You're given two envelopes, one containing twice as much money as the other. You open one envelope and see some amount of money. Should you switch to the other envelope? A naive analysis suggests you should always switch, which can't be right. There's also Simpson's paradox, where a trend appears in different groups of data but disappears or reverses when the groups are combined. Like our boy-girl problem, Simpson's paradox shows how statistical conclusions can be sensitive to how we frame and partition our data. All these paradoxes share a common theme. They exploit the gaps between our intuitive reasoning and the formal rules of probability and statistics. They're not just mathematical curiosities. They represent systematic biases in human thinking that can lead to real-world errors in judgment. In medical research, for instance, understanding conditional probability is crucial for interpreting diagnostic tests. A positive test result doesn't mean what most people think it means, and the reasoning is closely related to the logic we've been exploring. In artificial intelligence, these paradoxes are relevant to how we design systems that reason under uncertainty. An AI system that doesn't properly handle conditional probability will make systematic errors in its reasoning. While the boy or girl paradox might seem like a purely academic exercise, the probabilistic reasoning it illuminates has profound implications in many real-world contexts. In medical diagnosis, doctors constantly deal with conditional probabilities. If a patient tests positive for a rare disease, what's the probability they actually have the disease? The answer depends not just on the test's accuracy, but on the prevalence of the disease in the population. Many medical professionals struggle with these calculations, sometimes leading to overdiagnosis or unnecessary worry for patients. For example, imagine a cancer screening test that's 99% accurate and is applied to a population where 1 in 1,000 people have the cancer. If someone tests positive, most people would assume they have a 99% chance of having cancer. But the actual probability is less than 10%. The reasoning is exactly analogous to our boy-girl problem. We need to consider all the ways someone could test positive, not just focus on one scenario. In criminal justice, similar reasoning applies to evidence evaluation. If a piece of evidence is found at a crime scene, what's the probability that a particular suspect is guilty? This depends not just on how likely the evidence would be if the suspect were guilty, but also on how likely the evidence would be if the suspect were innocent, and on the prior probability of guilt. The famous prosecutor's fallacy occurs when lawyers or jurors confuse the probability of the evidence given guilt with the probability of guilt given the evidence. It's the same type of reasoning error that makes people think the answer to our paradox is 50% instead of 33%. In finance, these concepts are crucial for risk assessment and investment decision-making. When evaluating the probability of market events, investors need to understand how their information affects the likelihood of different outcomes. Failing to properly account for conditional probability can lead to systematic biases in investment decisions. Machine learning and artificial intelligence systems also rely heavily on these concepts. Bayesian networks, which are foundational to many AI applications, are essentially sophisticated ways of handling the kind of conditional probability reasoning we've been exploring. To truly understand why the boy or girl paradox is so confusing, we need to delve into the psychology of human reasoning. Our brains evolved to make quick decisions based on limited information, not to perform precise probabilistic calculations. One key factor is what psychologists call the availability heuristic. When we think about the other child, we naturally imagine a specific child and ask whether that child is a boy or girl. Since this feels like a straightforward binary choice, we default to 50-50 odds. But this mental shortcut leads us astray because we're not actually dealing with a randomly selected individual child. Another factor is our tendency toward what's called causal thinking. We naturally look for cause and effect relationships, even in situations governed by pure randomness. When we learn that at least one child is a boy, we unconsciously search for a causal mechanism that would make the other child more or less likely to be a boy. Since we can't find such a mechanism, we conclude the probability must be 50%. There's also an element of anchoring bias at play. The 50-50 probability of any individual child being a boy or girl serves as an anchor for our reasoning about the family composition. Once this anchor is set, we have difficulty adjusting away from it, even when the mathematical structure of the problem demands a different answer. Interestingly, research has shown that people with more mathematical training are not necessarily better at avoiding these errors. Even professional mathematicians often give the wrong answer when first encountering these problems. This suggests that the errors aren't due to lack of mathematical knowledge, but to deeper features of how human reasoning works. The confusion also stems from ambiguity in natural language. When we say at least one child is a boy, this can be interpreted in multiple ways, each leading to different mathematical models. Our brains try to resolve this ambiguity by defaulting to the most psychologically natural interpretation, which isn't always the mathematically intended one. Cultural factors may also play a role. In cultures that emphasize individual agency and choice, people might be more likely to think about the problem in terms of a specific child's gender, rather than in terms of family composition patterns. Researchers have conducted numerous experiments to understand how people reason about problems like the boy or girl paradox. The results consistently show that most people give incorrect answers, but they also reveal interesting patterns in how different groups think about probability. In one classic study, researchers presented the paradox to groups of undergraduate students, graduate students in mathematics, and professional mathematicians. Surprisingly, all three groups performed poorly on their first attempt, with correct response rates below 30% in all groups. However, when given time to reflect and discuss the problem, the mathematicians were much more likely to arrive at the correct answer. Another interesting finding is that people's performance varies significantly depending on how the problem is presented. When the problem is framed in terms of concrete scenarios, like families with children, people perform worse than when it's presented as an abstract probability problem. This suggests that our real-world intuitions actually interfere with our ability to reason mathematically. Researchers have also found cultural differences in how people approach these problems. Participants from cultures that emphasize collective thinking and group relationships sometimes perform better on problems involving conditional probability, possibly because they're more naturally inclined to think about relationships between multiple entities rather than focusing on individuals. Age also appears to matter. Interestingly, very young children, who haven't yet developed strong intuitions about probability, sometimes perform better on simplified versions of these problems than adolescents or adults. This suggests that our probabilistic common sense can actually be a hindrance to correct reasoning. One particularly revealing study used eye-tracking technology to observe how people visually process probability problems. The researchers found that people who give incorrect answers tend to focus their attention differently than those who give correct answers. Incorrect reasoners focus more on individual elements of the problem, while correct reasoners spend more time considering the relationships between different possibilities. These experimental findings have important implications for education. They suggest that teaching probability effectively requires not just conveying mathematical techniques, but actively helping students overcome their intuitive biases. The boy or girl paradox serves as an excellent teaching tool for probability theory, precisely because it so effectively exposes the gaps in our intuitive understanding. Effective teachers use this paradox not just to convey correct mathematical techniques, but to help students develop better probabilistic thinking more generally. One successful teaching approach is to have students work through the problem using multiple methods. First, they might enumerate all possible outcomes, as we did earlier. Then they might approach it using formal probability theory and Bayes' theorem. Finally, they might simulate the problem using random number generators or physical experiments like coin flipping. This multifaceted approach helps students see that the same mathematical truth can be arrived at through different paths, building confidence in the counterintuitive result. Simulation is particularly powerful because it provides concrete empirical evidence that supports the mathematical analysis. Another effective technique is to present multiple variations of the problem, showing how small changes in wording or setup can lead to different answers. This helps students develop sensitivity to the precise conditions and assumptions that underlie probability calculations. Some teachers use physical demonstrations like having students act out families or draw cards from decks to make the abstract mathematics more concrete. These kinesthetic approaches can help students who struggle with purely symbolic reasoning. The paradox also provides an excellent discussion the nature of mathematical truth and the role of counterintuitive results in advancing our understanding. Students learn that mathematics sometimes contradicts our intuitions. And that's not a failure of mathematics, but a feature that allows us to discover truths that wouldn't be accessible through common sense alone. For more advanced students, the paradox serves as a gateway to deeper topics in probability theory, such as the philosophical differences between frequentist and Bayesian interpretations of probability, or the role of prior information in statistical inference. For those interested in diving deeper into the mathematical aspects of the boy or girl paradox, there are several advanced extensions and generalizations that reveal even more about the nature of probability and information. One extension involves families with more than 2 children. If a family has 3 children and at least one is a boy, what's the probability that all 3 are boys? Following the same logic, there are 8 possible gender combinations for 3 children, and the condition at least one is a boy eliminates only one of them. Girl-girl. Among the remaining 7 combinations, only one has all boys. So the probability is 1/7. This can be generalized to families of any size. For a family with n children where at least one is a boy, the probability that all are boys is 1/2 to the n-1. As the family size increases, this probability approaches 0, which makes intuitive sense. Another extension involves varying the probability that any individual child is a boy. In reality, slightly more boys are born than girls, with the ratio being approximately 51.2% boys to 48.8% girls. How does this affect our paradox? It turns out that the calculations become more complex, but the fundamental principle remains the same. We need to consider all possible family compositions that satisfy our condition, weight them by their probabilities, and then calculate the conditional probability of interest. We can also extend the problem to continuous variables. Instead of discrete boy-girl outcomes, imagine we're dealing with children's heights, and we know that at least one child in a two-child family is taller than average. What's the probability that both children are taller than average? The mathematics becomes more involved, requiring integration rather than simple counting. But the conceptual framework is identical. Information theory provides another lens through which to view the paradox. When we learn that at least one child is a boy, we're gaining information that reduces our uncertainty about the family composition. Information theory gives us precise ways to quantify how much information we've gained and how that information affects the remaining uncertainty. The boy or girl paradox raises deep philosophical questions about the nature of probability, knowledge, and reality. These questions have been debated by philosophers and mathematicians for centuries. And the paradox provides a concrete context for exploring abstract philosophical concepts. One fundamental question is, what does probability actually mean? When we say the probability is 1/3, are we describing something objective about the world, or are we describing our state of knowledge about the world? Different philosophical schools give different answers. The frequentist interpretation says that probability describes the long-run frequency of outcomes in repeated experiments. From this perspective, our 1/3 probability means that if we examined many families meeting our condition, about 1/3 would have 2 boys. The subjective or Bayesian interpretation says that probability describes our degree of belief or confidence in different outcomes. From this perspective, the 1/3 probability represents how confident we should be that both children are boys, given our current information. These different interpretations can lead to different approaches to analyzing the paradox, though in this case, they yield the same numerical answer. The paradox also touches on questions about the nature of information and how learning new facts affects our knowledge. When we learn that at least one child is a boy, we're not learning about any specific child. Instead, we're learning something about the family structure that constrains the possible realities. This raises interesting questions about what it means to know something and how different types of knowledge relate to each other. There's also a connection to the philosophy of mind and cognition. Why do our brains systematically make errors on problems like this? Some philosophers and cognitive scientists argue that these errors reveal fundamental features of how human reasoning works, possibly reflecting evolutionary adaptations that serve us well in everyday life, but fail in abstract mathematical contexts. The paradox also relates to questions about the relationship between mathematics and reality. Is the counterintuitive result a discovery about the world, or is it merely a consequence of the mathematical framework we've chosen to apply? Different philosophical positions on the nature of mathematics would give different answers to this question. The boy or girl paradox, like many mathematical concepts, doesn't exist in a cultural vacuum. The way people think about and respond to the paradox can be influenced by cultural factors, social background, and even historical context. In cultures with strong preferences for male children, the framing of the problem in terms of boys and girls can introduce emotional and cultural associations that interfere with mathematical reasoning. Some educators have found that restating the problem in culturally neutral terms, using colors or abstract symbols instead of genders, can improve performance. The paradox also reflects certain assumptions about family structure that may not be universal. The assumption that families have exactly 2 children, that children's genders are independent, and that boys and girls are equally likely, all reflect specific demographic and biological contexts. In cultures or historical periods where these assumptions don't hold, the mathematical analysis would need to be modified. There are also interesting connections to social issues around gender and identity. As our understanding of gender becomes more nuanced and inclusive, how should we modify problems like this? If we acknowledge that gender isn't strictly binary, does that change the mathematical structure of the problem? These questions highlight how mathematical models both reflect and shape our understanding of social reality. The way the paradox is communicated and taught can also reflect and reinforce social patterns. Who gets exposed to these kinds of mathematical puzzles? What cultural capital is required to engage with them effectively? How do different teaching approaches affect students from different backgrounds? Some researchers have found that students from backgrounds where collective decision-making is emphasized sometimes approach probability problems differently than students from more individualistic cultures. This suggests that cultural values can influence mathematical reasoning in subtle ways. The history of the paradox itself reflects certain cultural patterns. The fact that it was developed and popularized primarily by male mathematicians writing for educated, middle-class audiences may have influenced how it's framed and what aspects of it have received attention. These cultural dimensions don't invalidate the mathematical content of the paradox, but they do remind us that mathematics always exists within social and cultural contexts that shape how it's understood and applied. Having taught this paradox to countless students over the years, certain questions and misconceptions come up repeatedly. Addressing these directly can help clarify the most challenging aspects of the problem. But if I know one child is a boy, why isn't the other child just a 50-50 chance of being a boy or girl? This is by far the most common question, and it reflects the fundamental conceptual hurdle. The key insight is that we haven't randomly selected one child and learned its gender. Instead, we've learned something about the family composition that eliminates certain possibilities. Think of it this way. We're not asking about the other child of a randomly selected boy. We're asking about families that meet a certain criterion. What if the parents chose to have a boy first? This question reflects concerns about independence assumptions. In our mathematical model, we assume that children's genders are independent, random events. If parents somehow influence their children's genders, that would change the problem. But under standard biological assumptions, the gender of one child doesn't affect the gender of the next. Doesn't this depend on exactly how we learn that at least one child is a boy? This is a sophisticated question that gets at the heart of why these problems are so sensitive to precise wording. Yes, the method by which we acquired the information can matter. If someone randomly selected one child and told us that child was a boy, the answer would be different. The mathematical analysis assumes we learned about the family composition in a way that doesn't introduce additional biases. What if more boys are born than girls? This is a good question about real-world applications. In reality, slightly more boys are born than girls. This would change the numerical answer, but not the fundamental principle. We would still need to consider all possible family compositions, weight them by their actual probabilities, and calculate the conditional probability. I still don't believe it. Can you prove it with a simulation? Absolutely. And this is often the most convincing approach for skeptical students. We can write a computer program that generates thousands of two-child families, filters for those with at least one boy, and counts how many have two boys. The result consistently comes out close to 1/3. One of the most powerful ways to build intuition for the boy or girl paradox is through simulation and empirical verification. Modern computers make it easy to generate thousands or millions of hypothetical families and test our theoretical predictions. Here's how a simple simulation might work. We generate random two-child families by flipping a fair coin twice for each family. Heads represents a boy, tails represents a girl. We then filter our results to keep only families where at least one child is a boy. Finally, we count what fraction of these filtered families have two boys. When we run this simulation with a large number of families, say 1 million, we consistently get results very close to 33%. This empirical evidence strongly supports our theoretical calculation and can be very convincing for people who remain skeptical of the mathematical argument. We can extend the simulation to test various modifications of the problem. What happens if we change the probability of any individual child being a boy? What if we consider families with 3 children? What if we add additional constraints? The simulation approach lets us quickly explore these variations and see how they affect the results. Simulation also helps us understand the role of sample size in probability. With small samples, we might see results that deviate significantly from the theoretical prediction due to random variation. But as the sample size increases, the simulated results converge toward the theoretical value. This illustrates an important principle in probability and statistics for students learning programming. Creating these simulations provides an excellent hands-on way to explore probability concepts. They can experiment with different parameters, visualize the results, and develop intuition for how probability works in practice. Historical note: before computers were widely available, some mathematicians actually performed physical experiments to test probability paradoxes. They would flip coins, draw cards, or use other random processes to generate empirical data, while more time-consuming than computer simulations. These physical experiments can provide a very tangible connection to the abstract mathematical concepts. Modern educational technology has made these simulations more accessible than ever. Interactive web applications let students adjust parameters and immediately see how the results change, providing real-time feedback on their understanding. The probabilistic reasoning highlighted by the boy or girl paradox has become increasingly relevant in our technology-driven world. Understanding conditional probability is crucial for many modern applications, from search engines to medical AI to autonomous vehicles. Search engines use probabilistic reasoning to determine which web pages are most relevant to a user's query. When you type in search terms, the engine doesn't just look for exact matches. Instead, it calculates the conditional probability that a page is relevant given the presence of certain words, the page's link structure, user behavior data, and many other factors. The same type of reasoning that makes the boy or girl paradox counterintuitive underlies these complex relevance calculations. Machine learning algorithms, particularly those used in artificial intelligence, rely heavily on Bayesian reasoning. When an AI system learns from data, it's essentially updating its beliefs about the world based on new evidence. This is exactly the same process we used when we learned that at least one child is a boy, and updated our probability that both children are boys. Medical AI systems face particularly challenging versions of these problems. When analyzing medical images or patient data, they must calculate the probability of various diagnoses given the observed symptoms and test results. The same reasoning errors that lead people to think the boy or girl paradox answer is 50% can lead to misinterpretation of medical test results, potentially with serious consequences. Autonomous vehicles must constantly make probabilistic assessments about their environment. Is that object in the road a pedestrian or a piece of debris? What's the probability that the car in the next lane will change lanes? These systems use sophisticated versions of the same conditional probability reasoning we've been exploring. Spam filters provide another everyday example. When your email system decides whether a message is spam, it's calculating the probability that the message is spam given various features like the sender, subject line, content, and so forth. The mathematical principles are identical to those in our paradox. Even social media algorithms use these concepts. When deciding which posts to show in your feed, the platform calculates the probability that you'll engage with different types of content based on your past behavior, the behavior of similar users, and the characteristics of the posts themselves. The boy or girl paradox has become a cornerstone of statistical education because it so effectively demonstrates the gap between intuitive and mathematical thinking. Understanding how to teach this paradox well has broader implications for how we help students develop statistical literacy. Research in mathematics education has shown that students learn probability concepts best when they're presented with problems that challenge their preconceptions. The boy or girl paradox is perfect for this because almost everyone has a strong initial intuition that turns out to be wrong. This creates what educators call cognitive conflict, which motivates deeper learning. Effective teaching of the paradox typically involves several phases. First, students make their initial predictions, usually 50%. Then they work through the mathematical analysis, often with some resistance and skepticism. Next, they verify the result through simulation or enumeration. Finally, they reflect on why their initial intuition was wrong and what this reveals about probabilistic reasoning more generally. The paradox also serves as an excellent introduction to more advanced topics in statistics. Students who master the boy or girl paradox are better prepared to understand concepts like sensitivity and specificity in medical testing, the prosecutor's fallacy in legal reasoning, and base rate neglect in decision-making. One challenge in teaching the paradox is that different students struggle with different aspects of it. Some students have trouble with the enumeration of possible outcomes. Others understand the enumeration but struggle with the conditional probability calculation. Still others accept the mathematics but can't reconcile it with their intuition. This suggests that effective teaching requires multiple approaches and plenty of time for discussion and reflection. Students need opportunities to verbalize their thinking, hear other perspectives, and gradually reconstruct their understanding of how probability works. The paradox also highlights the importance of precise mathematical language. Small changes in how a problem is stated can lead to dramatically different answers, and students need to develop sensitivity to these linguistic subtleties. The cognitive biases revealed by the boy or girl paradox don't just affect how we solve abstract mathematics problems. They influence our decision-making in countless real-world situations, often in ways we don't recognize. Consider medical decision-making. When a patient receives a positive test result for a medical condition, both patients and doctors often overestimate the probability that the patient actually has the condition. This happens because they focus on the accuracy of the test rather than considering the base rate of the condition in the population. The reasoning error is closely related to the one that makes people think the answer to our paradox is 50%. In business and investing, these biases can lead to systematic errors in risk assessment. Investors might overestimate the probability of certain outcomes because they focus on specific scenarios rather than considering the full range of possibilities. Understanding conditional probability can lead to better investment decisions and more accurate risk management. Legal reasoning is another area where these concepts matter. Juries and judges must often evaluate evidence and calculate the probability of guilt or innocence. The prosecutor's fallacy, where people confuse the probability of the evidence given guilt with the probability of guilt given the evidence, is a direct application of the same reasoning we've been exploring. Even in everyday life, we constantly make decisions based on probabilistic reasoning. Should you carry an umbrella? That depends on the probability of rain given the current weather conditions. Should you leave early for an appointment? That depends on the probability of traffic delays given the time of day and route you're taking. Understanding the principles behind the boy or girl paradox can make us more effective decision makers by helping us recognize when our intuitive reasoning about probability might be leading us astray. It encourages us to think more systematically about uncertainty and to consider multiple scenarios rather than focusing on the most obvious or salient possibilities. The paradox also teaches us the importance of being precise about the information we have and how we obtained it. Different ways of learning the same fact can lead to different probabilistic conclusions, and this sensitivity to information structure is crucial for good decision-making. The basic boy or girl paradox has spawned numerous variations and extensions in mathematical and psychological research. These variations help us understand the boundaries of the cognitive biases involved and explore how different factors affect probabilistic reasoning. One interesting variation involves birth order. Instead of just knowing that at least one child is a boy, what if we know that the older child is a boy or the younger child? These variations change the answer because they provide more specific information about the family structure. Another variation involves meeting the family in different contexts. What if you're told that a family with 2 children lives on your street and you see a boy playing in their yard? The probability calculation depends on assumptions about how likely you are to see boys versus girls playing outside. Introducing additional complexities. Researchers have also explored versions where the basic 50-50 assumption doesn't hold. What if we're dealing with a population where cultural preferences lead to different probabilities for boys and girls? Or what if we're considering biological factors that might make certain family compositions more or less likely? Some studies have looked at how the paradox generalizes to other contexts entirely. Instead of children's genders, we might consider coin flips, card draws, or any other binary random events. The mathematical structure remains the same, but people's performance sometimes varies depending on the specific context. Temporal variations are also interesting. What if we're told that a family had at least one boy among their first 2 children, and now they're having a 3rd child? How does this information affect our predictions about the 3rd child's gender? These problems help us understand how people reason about sequences of events. Cross-cultural research has revealed interesting differences in how people from different backgrounds approach these problems. Some cultures seem to produce individuals who are more naturally inclined toward the type of systematic thinking required to solve the paradox correctly. Developmental studies have shown how children's understanding of the paradox changes with age. Interestingly, very young children sometimes outperform adolescents, possibly because they haven't yet developed the strong intuitive biases that interfere with correct reasoning. The boy or girl paradox has made appearances in various forms of popular culture, from television shows to novels to internet discussions. These appearances both reflect and shape public understanding of probability and mathematical reasoning. Television game shows have featured versions of the paradox, sometimes with large sums of money at stake. These high-stakes applications demonstrate the real-world importance of understanding conditional probability, as contestants' financial outcomes depend on their ability to reason correctly about uncertain events. The paradox has appeared in crime dramas and legal thrillers, where characters must evaluate evidence and assess the likelihood of different scenarios. These fictional treatments often highlight the counterintuitive nature of probabilistic reasoning and the potential consequences of getting it wrong. Internet forums and social media have become venues for spirited debates about the paradox. These discussions reveal how deeply the problem challenges people's thinking and how emotionally invested they can become in defending their initial intuitions. Educational YouTube channels and podcasts have created numerous explanations of the paradox, each attempting to make the counterintuitive result more accessible to general audiences. The variety of approaches reflects the challenge of communicating complex mathematical concepts to diverse audiences. The paradox has also influenced the development of educational games and apps designed to teach probability concepts. These interactive tools let users experiment with different scenarios and see the results of their reasoning in real time. Popular science books frequently use the paradox as an example of counterintuitive mathematical results. These treatments help bring advanced mathematical concepts to broader audiences and demonstrate the relevance of abstract mathematics to everyday thinking. Despite decades of research on the boy or girl paradox, several interesting questions remain open, and new applications continue to emerge as our world becomes increasingly data-driven and probabilistic. One active area of research involves understanding individual differences in probabilistic reasoning. Why do some people naturally give the correct answer while others struggle with it? Are there cognitive or educational factors that predict performance? Can we design interventions that help people overcome their biases more effectively? Another frontier involves the application of these concepts to artificial intelligence and machine learning. As AI systems become more sophisticated, they need to handle increasingly complex forms of probabilistic reasoning. Understanding human biases in this area can help us design AI systems that avoid similar pitfalls. The paradox also raises questions about the nature of mathematical intuition. Should we try to train our intuition to align better with mathematical reality, or should we accept that intuition and formal reasoning serve different purposes? How can we help people recognize when to trust their intuition versus when to rely on systematic analysis? Educational researchers continue to explore better ways to teach probabilistic reasoning. Virtual reality and interactive simulations offer new possibilities for helping students visualize and experience probability concepts. Can these technologies help students develop better intuitive understanding of conditional probability? There are also philosophical questions about the relationship between mathematical models and reality. The boy or girl paradox assumes certain things about how families are formed and how we learn information about them. As our society changes, do these assumptions remain valid? How should we modify our models to reflect evolving social realities? Climate science, epidemiology, and other fields increasingly rely on complex probabilistic models that involve the same type of reasoning highlighted by the paradox. Understanding how experts and the public interpret these models is crucial for effective science communication and policymaking. To really master the boy or girl paradox, it helps to work through various exercises and thought experiments. These activities can deepen your understanding and help you apply the principles to new situations. Exercise 1. Try creating your own simulation of the paradox. You can use a simple programming language, a spreadsheet, or even physical objects like coins. Generate many two-child families. Filter for those with at least one boy and count the fraction with 2 boys. How close do your results come to the theoretical 1/3? Exercise 2. Consider a modified version where you know that at least one child is a boy named John. Assume that exactly 1% of all boys are named John. How does this additional information change the probability that both children are boys? Work through the calculation and think about why the answer is different. Exercise 3. Imagine you're a medical researcher studying a diagnostic test. The test is 90% accurate for detecting a disease that affects 1% of the population. If someone tests positive, what's the probability they actually have the disease? This is a direct application of the same reasoning used in the boy or girl paradox. Exercise 4. Create variations of the paradox using different contexts. Instead of children's genders, consider coin flips, card draws, or any other binary random events. Do you find certain contexts easier to reason about than others? What does this tell you about how context affects mathematical thinking? Exercise 5. Try explaining the paradox to friends or family members. Pay attention to where they struggle and what types of explanations are most effective. Teaching others is often the best way to deepen your own understanding. Thought experiment 1. Imagine a world where the boy or girl paradox had a different answer. What would have to be different about probability theory or about how families are formed? This exercise helps you understand which assumptions are crucial to the paradox. Thought experiment 2. Consider how you might design a psychological experiment to study people's reasoning about the paradox. What variables would you manipulate? What would you measure? How would you control for potential confounding factors? These exercises and thought experiments help transform the boy or girl paradox from a passive curiosity into an active tool for understanding probability and human reasoning. As we reach the end of our deep dive into the boy or girl paradox, it's worth reflecting on what this seemingly simple problem has taught us about mathematics, psychology, and human nature. The paradox reveals that our intuitive understanding of probability, while useful in many everyday situations, can systematically mislead us in certain contexts. This isn't a failure of human intelligence, but rather a consequence of how our brains evolved to handle uncertainty in a complex world. Our probabilistic intuitions served our ancestors well in their environment, but they sometimes fail us in the abstract mathematical contexts that characterize modern life. The one-third answer isn't just a mathematical curiosity. It represents a fundamentally different way of thinking about information and uncertainty. Instead of focusing on individual cases, we learn to consider entire populations of possibilities. Instead of relying on gut feelings, we develop systematic methods for handling complex probabilistic relationships. This shift in thinking has practical implications far beyond abstract mathematics. In our data-driven world, the ability to reason correctly about conditional probability affects decisions in medicine, law, business, and countless other domains. Understanding the boy or girl paradox is a step toward becoming a more effective decision-maker in an uncertain world. The paradox also teaches us humility about the limits of human reasoning. Even highly intelligent, well-educated people struggle with this problem. This should make us more cautious about trusting our intuitions in complex situations and more open to using systematic methods for analyzing uncertainty. Perhaps most importantly, the paradox demonstrates the power of mathematics to reveal truths that are invisible to common sense. The fact that the answer is 1/3 rather than 50% isn't arbitrary or conventional. It's a deep truth about how information and probability interact. A truth that we can discover through careful mathematical analysis, but would never arrive at through intuition alone. This is what makes mathematics so valuable and so fascinating. It extends our cognitive abilities beyond their natural limits, allowing us to navigate complexities that would otherwise overwhelm us. The boy or girl paradox is a perfect example of this process in action. The journey we've taken through this paradox also illustrates how mathematical understanding develops. We started with a simple question that seemed to have an obvious answer. Through careful analysis, we discovered that the obvious answer was wrong. We then worked to understand why our intuition failed and what the correct reasoning looks like. Finally, we explored the broader implications and applications of our new understanding. This process of moving from intuition through confusion to clarity and finally to broader insight is characteristic of mathematical learning more generally. It's often uncomfortable, sometimes frustrating, but ultimately rewarding as we develop new ways of seeing and understanding the world. As you encounter other probability problems in the future, remember the lessons of the boy or girl paradox. Be suspicious of your initial intuitions. Think carefully about what information you have and how you obtained it. Consider all possible scenarios, not just the most obvious ones. And don't be afraid to challenge your own reasoning when you encounter counterintuitive results. The world is full of situations where probabilistic reasoning matters, and the stakes are often much higher than in abstract mathematical puzzles. Medical diagnoses, legal decisions, business strategies, and personal choices all involve reasoning under uncertainty. The clearer you're thinking about probability, the better equipped you'll be to navigate these challenges successfully. Remember, too, that mathematics is not just about getting the right answer, but about understanding why that answer is right. The boy or girl paradox teaches us that the why is often more important and more interesting than the what. Understanding the reasoning behind the 1/3 answer gives us tools we can apply to countless other problems, while simply memorizing the answer would be of limited value.